Hello everyone, welcome back to Waking Cosmos, a philosophical podcast exploring the nature of consciousness and its place in reality. It feels like a little while since I've made a podcast. Last month I was working on a video episode, and so a lot of my attention was on that for a while. And you can check that out on the YouTube channel if you're interested. It was a video exploring consciousness in science fiction. But things have been busy with me. I recently moved back to the UK, and so I've been gradually reintegrating back into life here. I'm also looking for a new place to live, hopefully somewhere a bit closer to the forest. That would be nice. So it's quite a busy time for me at the moment, but it's great to finally sit down and make another podcast. And I've definitely missed it. It's still my dream to make Waking Cosmos a full-time project. I'm not there yet, so I'm doing a few other things to make ends meet, but hopefully the day will come and these episodes can become more regular and hopefully continue to improve in quality. If this is the first episode that you've listened to, welcome. This is a podcast and sometimes video series in which we explore the philosophical mysteries of consciousness and existence and life's place more broadly in the universe. I talk to a variety of philosophers and experts who offer unique and, I think, interesting perspectives which you might not have heard before. And so far it's been an amazing experience for me. Hopefully that comes across. I do research all of these conversations quite thoroughly before they happen. I like to go quite deeply into the ideas of my guests before we have a conversation. So when I actually come to do the podcast, it's an amazing experience because I've read a lot and I've consumed a lot of information, but then I get to have this conversation with the person who actually had the ideas. And honestly, I'm finding it amazing that I'm just sort of somehow able to do this and get away with it. Anyway, I'm really enjoying these conversations and I hope you are too. Today, my friends, is no different. I'm joined by the brilliant philosopher David Pearce, who, in addition to thinking very deeply about the mystery of consciousness, he is the co-founder with Nick Bostrom, whom some of you, I'm sure, will have heard of the World Transhumanist Association, also known as Humanity Plus. David is most famous for arguing that we have an ethical obligation, to the extent to which it is in our power, to abolish suffering in all sentient life. And he believes that technologies which already exist suggest that this is possible, to end suffering throughout the entire natural world and eventually the entire reachable universe. And so if that sounds quite unbelievable to you, this is going to be an interesting episode because David is very convincing and quite a brilliant thinker. In addition to that topic, we also talk about panpsychism, which David is quite sympathetic to. He's not a materialist. And for those of you that might not know, panpsychism very generally is the idea that consciousness or awareness could be fundamental in some way to reality. Quite a regular topic on the podcast these days. We also talk about the possibility of a discoverable universal ethics, which is another close interest for me. And we explore the idea that any sufficiently advanced society of minds might eventually converge on a kind of universal ethics. We also get into David's views about aging and death and the potential technological facilitation of immortality. As always, if you enjoy this episode and like what I'm trying to do here with Waking Cosmos, please consider supporting me on Patreon through the link in the description. It is through Patreon that I'm trying to turn this into a full-time project. So if you want to make an impact on Waking Cosmos and my life, Patreon is really the place to go. And of course, don't forget to hit like and share the episode with anyone that you think might be interested. All right, without further delay, I give you David Pearce. Hi David, thanks for joining me.
Hello Adrian, greetings from Brighton.
Greetings. So, I think you're best known for your views about ending suffering and how through rewriting our genetic source code and by using technologies of various kinds, we're eventually going to set about ending suffering of all kinds forever, or ending experiences which are, as you term them, below hedonic zero. And not just in ourselves, in humans, but in the long term, the entire natural world. You've called this goal of ending suffering the abolitionist project. Could you summarize the abolitionist project, and then we'll get further into it?
Yeah, it's a very good summary. Of course, there's nothing especially new about the idea of ending suffering. It's implicit in Buddhism. What's changed has been biotechnology cracking the genome. And yeah, back in 1995, I wrote an online manifesto called The Hedonistic Imperative. Why this title? It sounds rather debauched, but yes, not merely do I think it likely and ethically desirable that we're going to reprogram the biosphere to get rid of suffering in all sentient beings. I also think it likely that we will replace the biology of suffering and malaise with gradients of intelligent bliss, quite likely orders of magnitude richer than anything accessible today. However, from a purely ethical perspective, that's very much the icing on the cake. I'm personally a negative utilitarian. I think our overriding obligation is to minimize and prevent suffering. But I think the point to make here is that one needn't be a negative utilitarian or utilitarian of any kind to recognize that, yes, we should get rid of any form of suffering.
Hmm. So, in talking about ending suffering, you're talking about transhumanism, going beyond human nature as it currently exists. You certainly identify as a transhumanist, and yet how you see the future of humanity, I think, is quite different to, say, Ray Kurzweil and other singularity types. And from what I can tell, the difference, the point at which you diverge with many of the other transhumanists that I know of, is in your views about consciousness, and specifically that artificial intelligences or intelligences which are based on computation will never become conscious. And this is a fact which is going to significantly set things back against, say, Ray Kurzweil's timeline for the singularity. So why do you believe that? What is going on in a brain which couldn't also be going on inside a computer?
Uh, First of all, I think one needs to ask, what is consciousness for in biological organisms? What's its adaptive function, or is it just a spandrel? And I think that the functional role of consciousness is phenomenal binding, non-psychotic binding. It is binding that allows what would otherwise be purely distributed neuronal feature processors to assemble perceptual objects, populating a unitary world simulation. And I don't think that a classically parallel connectionist system, a classical serial digital computer is capable of phenomenal binding, that even if, and this is a conjecture I take very seriously, consciousness is fundamental to the world, the most that any classical digital computer will ever be is a micro-experiential zombie. Big question, of course, is why our central nervous systems are any different. And here we come on to the quantum mind stuff. Perhaps the best way to understand, I think, why binding is so computationally, functionally vital, why it's essentially the greatest computational achievement of organic minds over the past 500 million years, is to look at syndromes where binding even partially breaks down. I mean, someone with, let's say, simultanagnosia, who can only see one object at once, or cerebral achinopsia or motion blindness, who can't see motion, or someone with florid schizophrenia who hasn't got anything resembling a unitary self. This is profoundly incapacitating. And though there are workarounds, at least for local binding, essentially, yes, classical digital computers are at most micro-experiential zombies. And so scenarios, Kurzweilian scenarios involving a complete, let's say, mind uploading, total fusion with humans and our machines, I don't think are viable.
So in your view, it's quantum binding which is bringing all of the cognitive processes in the brain together. And so the unity of conscious experience is a quantum unity. So are you saying that quantum binding is consciousness? What is the nature of consciousness in your view?
Well, this is the so-called intrinsic nature argument for non-materialist physicalism. Essentially, no progress has been made solving the hard problem of consciousness since Democritus. And if you are a non-materialist physicalist, you don't say that consciousness is fundamentally attached to basic matter and energy. Instead, the claim of non-materialist physicalism, associated with people like Galen Strawson or most recently Phil Goff, is this idea that consciousness discloses the intrinsic nature of the physical, the fire in the equations. Physics tells us and gives an exhaustive account of the structural relational properties of matter and energy, but the actual nature of the fire in the equations is something on which physics is silent. And indeed, it's actually, as you know, it's a doctrinaire materialist Stephen Hawking who is associated with this poetic metaphor of the fire in the equations, what Kant called the noumenal essence of the world, and intuitively it might seem unknowable, but what the non-materialist physicalist says is that actually we do have some privileged insight into the intrinsic nature of reality, the fire into the equations, and that is in the form of our own minds and the world simulations we run. And what we discover is that the intrinsic nature of a quantum field is not, as one might naively imagine. Intuitively, quantum field theory describes fields of insentience, but rather instead quantum field theory describes fields of sentience. Essentially, any satisfactory theory of consciousness, I would say, it has to make novel, precise, experimentally falsifiable predictions that both proponents and critics alike can agree will be relevant to the issue. More and substantively, any satisfactory theory of consciousness must explain the existence of consciousness in the first place, how it is possible for consciousness to have causal efficacy, and not merely causal efficacy, but causal functional efficacy, i.e. you can ask me questions about consciousness and I can reply. And any satisfactory theory of consciousness must also solve the phenomenal binding problem. Why aren't you just 86 billion odd discrete membrane-bound classical neurons as you are in a dreamless sleep? And the intrinsic nature argument for non-materialist physicalism has, at least in the quantum theoretic version, it has answers to those four substantive questions. And this, to my mind, is what makes it really interesting, the quantum theoretic version, is that it's actually experimentally testable. It's not just some idle philosophical opinion, that if it is really the case that what crude, temporarily coarse-grained neuroscanning says are distributed neuronal feature processes firing when you see a perceptual object is really coherent superposition, then the non-classical interference signature will tell us. I personally think, or at least tentatively think, that when we probe the CNS at sufficiently temporally fine-grained scales, we will find a perfect structural match. What's odd at present is that we find a partial structural match. Edge detectors firing, motion detectors, color detectors, but no unitary perceptual objects. And this, more than anything else, is what induces David Chalmers to endorse dualism. And if there is not a perfect structural match between our minds and ultimately the formalism of physics, then, yeah, as far as I can tell, dualism is true.
So just to summarize, this is a form of quantum panpsychism. And so the intrinsic nature argument is that science is telling us, of course, all of this amazing stuff about the world, but it only actually tells us about this causal outer nature of things. And it doesn't actually tell us what the world is in itself, the intrinsic nature of things, what breathes fire into the equations. And of course, consciousness is the only intrinsic nature that we actually know of, this sort of mysterious interior quality. And so perhaps the intrinsic nature argument suggests that this mysterious interior nature of our minds is actually a rarefied expression of the interior nature of the world. And so that's the intrinsic nature argument. But you're saying that the way consciousness is sort of vectored into more complicated organisms like us is through quantum entanglement, essentially. I think for me, for panpsychism to be a plausible account, there does need to be an explanation of why we ought to expect something like consciousness or a very basic awareness of some kind to be existing at the foundations of things. And maybe a possible answer is along the lines of, well, existence itself entails an essentially self-realizing nature. And perhaps that entails that existence and consciousness are actually inseparable from each other in some way. But I think most of us will be used to thinking about consciousness as more of a highly rarefied phenomenon, something that's emerging out of a great number of different processes. And so to say that it's a fundamental property, I think can be confusing for some people. And so to clarify, we're talking about a very basic property of interiority in the world. And in your view, it's this quantum binding that biological organisms are using that scales up this fundamental property. Is that the right way to say it?
Yes, I mean, standardly, we assume that there are two separate mysteries. Why does anything exist at all, and why some 500 or so million years ago, or just before, in the Cambrian explosion, consciousness erupted from nowhere. But the non-materialist physicalist says there is only one fundamental mystery in that sense, which is why there is something rather than nothing. Now, I think we can explore this mystery if you like, though it's arguably not central to the abolitionist project, though in one sense they're intimately linked. But essentially it collapses two mysteries into one. Just a word on consciousness. When some people use the term consciousness, they're really talking about reflective self-awareness or their serial stream of thought. So by consciousness, one needs to be clear what one means, basic what its likeness. The main reason people recoil from non-materialist physicalism or panpsychism is this intuition one has, of course, that essentially it's not like anything to be an electron or electron field. It's simply too small. But if in one sense, the particular quantum theoretic version of the intrinsic nature argument that I explore is even more implausible, but because it focuses not merely on spatial resolution, but also temporal resolution. It doesn't invoke any new principle of physics, just simply the unitary Schrödinger dynamics. It doesn't involve any additional philosophical assumption. It simply highlights that if, and it's obviously a huge if, consciousness discloses the intrinsic nature of the physical, then we must explore the nature of consciousness on the nature of picosecond, femtosecond, and attosecond temporal resolutions. And if you were to probe your CNS at this kind of extraordinarily temporarily fine-grained level, you wouldn't find 86 billion discrete, decohered classical neurons, but instead individual superpositions. I think it's only the ubiquity of the superposition principle that allows you to have the experience of a robustly law-like classical world, that the vehicle of our simulation is quantum coherent, but the subjective content is classical.
Right. And so we got into this because you made the argument that the predictions of a lot of the transhumanists relating to mind uploading and conscious artificial intelligences and so on are not as likely to be coming anytime soon as we might think, or at least not until our technologies actually find a way of hooking into this fundamental intrinsic nature. And that will involve manipulating a level of nature that we don't currently have a clear access to. But in principle, in your view, if we could learn to do that, we could fabricate a conscious mind. It's not impossible that we could do this at some point. And yet that's a very different proposition to computation and the continued advancement of Moore's law. So to move into your views about the future of humanity and our continued evolution, you've argued that significant changes we're going to go through will come about through our learning to rewrite our genetic source code. And so our ancestors, they may occupy a world of fantastic technologies and artificial intelligence, but for the foreseeable future, we will continue to be biological. I think one thing that you point out, which I feel is quite important to recognize, is that really evolution did not have happiness, and it certainly did not have super happiness in mind for us. And so our entire mental architecture is actually primarily shaped by that which was successful for reproduction. And so it's true in a way that until we do take matters into our own hands, we'll always have these vestiges of mental architecture which maybe served us very well when we were living on the plains of Africa or in the jungle, but they're not necessarily at all adaptive for life today in the modern world. So the question is, do you think it's possible that we'll one day decide that we don't need jealousy, for example, or these other retributive instincts? Will we one day just sort of leave these kinds of emotions behind forever?
Yes, I mean, jealousy is an extremely good example in that not merely would it be good to get rid of the nasty raw feels of jealousy, that there is no real cause to conserve its functional role. Contrast something like pain experienced in the presence of noxious stimuli, whereas even though it'd be very good to get rid of the nasty raw feels of pain, we're going to need to retain the function of nociception. In the case of something like jealousy, one can see why it's extraordinarily fitness enhancing, that the kind of would-be ancestor a few 100,000 years ago who decided that jealousy was stupid and that he'll let another man sleep with his wife, his genes weren't the ones that were passed on. Jealousy can already be transiently eliminated today under the influence of drugs like MDMA, ecstasy. Unfortunately, MDMA is potentially neurotoxic. But in future, we will be able to decide whether we want to preserve jealousy at all. Unfortunately, jealousy is relatively complex genetically, biologically. Something like pain sensitivity, on the other hand, is relatively amenable to interventions even now. And the standard example I give is the SCN9A gene, this kind of volume knob for pain. Nonsense mutations knock out the ability to experience any form of nasty raw feels, pain in that sense at all. But unfortunately, people with nonsense mutations of SCN9A, unfortunately, they lack the capacity for nociception, or rather they have to learn that certain stimuli are dangerous. They need to lead cotton wool existences. The solution, at least in the short to medium run, is clearly not to have nonsense mutations of SCN9A, but instead to choose some of the benign variants of SCN9A that are associated with extremely high pain thresholds. You look at today's genetic outliers who describe pain as just a useful signaling mechanism, and they exist at one extreme end of the spectrum. and that by choosing benign versions of SCN9A for our future children via pre-implantation genetic screening, by giving benign versions to domestic non-human animals, and using synthetic gene drives to spread them across the biosphere, essentially one can dramatically reduce the burden of physical pain in the living world. And the same is true, though it's much more complicated, with something like hedonic set points. Even tweaking a handful of genes, serotonin transporter, the COMT gene, catechol-methyltransferase. Essentially, I am glossing over a host of technical, sociological challenges. But nonetheless, if one treats it as a technical and ethical problem, there are solutions. That the level of suffering in the biosphere is shortly going to be an adjustable parameter, and long-term goal should be zero.
I think a couple of points to raise, and I need to play a bit of devil's advocate, because I think, some people are going to have the concern that suffering is something that we need, or that it's intrinsically balancing out the good, or it's how we learn. And so I do want us to respond to that. As you've mentioned, scientists have already identified existing genetic variances which make certain people more prone to positive emotions, and other genes which underpin depression and generally lower moods throughout life. So already it is in principle possible, by activating certain genes, that we could already be selecting for a happier future generation with less depression and greater emotional resilience. And yet most parents obviously aren't doing this at the moment. Most parents are, as you call it, just rolling the genetic dice. And I think the reason why, in addition to simply not being aware of these options, is that at least on some level it seems unnatural. It does evoke this spectre of eugenics. And so, how do you respond to this concern that actually changing the structure of our minds is unnatural and even dangerous?
Yes, it's quite an intuitively powerful response, yet we already intervene in countless ways in the living world, in nature. We construct these ghastly apparatus of factory farms and slaughterhouses, and do terrible things to non-human animals. Now that's unnatural. If you look around your environment now, I mean, you're not a naked ape living on this African savannah. You are surrounded by artifacts, the latest gadgets, mobile phone, and so on. We pick and choose what we like, we call natural, and what we don't like, we call unnatural. So yeah, it's going to take time. I think more people are comfortable with the idea of screening for well-known genetic diseases. If your child is going to be at risk for, let's say, cystic fibrosis, very few people actively urge that we should try and conserve all the hundreds of variants of the cystic fibrosis gene, for example. But where many people would draw the line is screening for something like mood or possibly pain sensitivity. But I think we do need to have, essentially a social, political dialogue here. That, every kid born into the world today is unique genetic experiment. Whether one is really entitled to bring more ethically, to bring more suffering into the world is debatable. But if one is really set on having children of one's own and not remaining childless or adopting, then I think, one essentially has an obligation to load the genetic dice in one's children's favor. And this involves not merely screening for the standard so-called physical genetic disorders, but also pre-selecting benign variants of genes involved in pain sensitivity and having a high or a low hedonic set point.
Yeah, I think that's well put. I do think that we still need to respond to the intuition that I think some people will be having, which is wait, isn't suffering an essential part of life? Suffering provides the contrast through which we're able to identify what is good and what is of value, and also what is bad and worth avoiding. And, we do seem to have a range of different experiences which we interpret as having a lot of value, and yet we also associate them with a certain degree of negative valence. And so, perhaps one example would be nostalgia. There seems to be this grain of sadness in nostalgia. There's this sense in which the past is gone and we can never go back. And yet it can also be a very beautiful emotion. And so if we do raise our hedonic range in the way that you're describing, entirely outside of the range of negative valence, is it possible that certain valued experiences would be lost in this, which are actually worth keeping?
You raise a number of important issues there. The issue, let's start with the issue of contrast. I mean, sadly, as we know today, there are some people who endure chronic low mood, chronic depression, chronic pain. One wouldn't say that their inability to experience pleasure somehow means that they're not really suffering. But conversely, there is nothing to stop us ratcheting up hedonic set points, hedonic range, so that instead we enjoy information-sensitive gradients of well-being. How steep or shallow should be these gradients? I mean, one could imagine a future civilization, if today's hedonic range is -10 to hedonic 0 to +10, a civilization whose hedonic range is +90 to a +100, which intuitively is less hedonic contrast. But if it really is regarded as essential to keep a very deep gradients, then one could have a civilization with a hedonic range of, let's say, +70 to a +100. And the absolute hedonic floor, +70, will still have a richer hedonic tone than even today's peak experiences. And nonetheless, of course, most people would be striving for life in the +90s. Now, that is clearly, for now, at any rate, science fictional. But what we can do for our children and grandchildren is aim to, as I said, ratchet up hedonic set points. And this stress on information sensitive gradients of well-being is important for two reasons, I think. First, by conserving hedonic gradients, you retain critical insight, social responsibility, capacity for progress, that it is adaptive and functional to retain these information sensitive gradients. But the second reason for laying such stress on information sensitive gradients of well-being or gradients of bliss is that it highlights how one isn't trying to impose one's own core values and preferences on others. Whatever your basic values, your greatest joys, what you like or dislike, hedonic recalibration it would give you an immeasurably richer quality of life, but it wouldn't ask you to give up your existing values unless, of course, one of your existing values is conserving the status quo.
Right. And, I think another important point that you've made is that on some level, it doesn't actually matter how much we achieve materially in the world. A lot of us imagine that if we became millionaires or we could achieve all of our desired goals, then we would somehow become happy. Or when we're surrounded by all of these fantastic technologies that the future is promising, and that we'll somehow finally achieve happiness and we'll be able to step off the hedonic treadmill, as you describe it. And yet, because of the structure of our minds as they've evolved prior to modernity, we are always going to be bound to a certain ceiling of happiness, which may actually not be very high at all for some people. We're restless beings in some sense. When we achieve our goals, our levels of happiness normalize quite quickly to, like I said, a level which can be actually quite low and certainly could be improved on. And so if we do ever wish to transcend the hedonic treadmill, as you put it, we will need to make changes to our minds on some level. Let's talk more about your view that eventually we'll, not only in ourselves, but we'll recognize the necessity of ending suffering in the entire natural world. How do you get to that view, and what might that actually look like?
First, it needs to be said that the idea of radically intervening in nature to mitigate, prevent, and ultimately abolish suffering, until we shut down, outlaw factory farms and slaughterhouses, this kind of initiative is fanciful. That probably the greatest source of severe, readily avoidable suffering in the world today is factory farming, slaughterhouses, and we have to tackle this first. Realistically, the only way I think we're going to get global veganism this century, though, is going to be via in vitro meat technologies. They need to be developed, commercialized, spread across the world, and we need to get factory farms and slaughterhouses shut. But what then? And here we come on to, which I will tackle now, which is suffering in nature. Perhaps I should just, before going on to your question there, I mean, I think a number of animal activists would say, well, this is just sort of crazy to think about wild animal suffering while we're still doing such terrible things to non-humans in factory farms and slaughterhouses. But at the moment, a lot of well-meaning people, effective altruists and the like, focus on such things as conservation initiatives, captive breeding programs. And yeah, we need to have a debate as to whether we want to conserve, whether we want to rewild, or whether we want to have essentially compassionate biology. Okay, sorry about that run-up. To tackle your question directly, yes, the living world, possibly if you're the kind of person who enjoys wildlife documentaries, David Attenborough and so on, one thinks of the living world as a wonderful, magical, delightful place, but essentially it is full of quite obscene suffering, of creatures dying of starvation, of being eaten alive, riddled with parasites, disemboweled, asphyxiated, nature red in tooth and claw. And whereas until recent decades this was simply a fact of life, we are now in a position where we can actually choose the level of suffering in the rest of the living world. The bedrock of any compassionate stewardship of nature, I think, would have to be cross-species fertility regulation by something like immunocontraception. It's already been tried, it's already done, let's say something like for elephants in Kruger National Park. But essentially it would need to be applied at a cross-species level, because otherwise interventions to help would simply lead to a population explosion and more suffering. But in terms of other kinds of suffering in nature, we need to have a debate. Do we want a living world based on creatures preying, terrorizing, eating each other? Now, personally, I would be completely relaxed about the idea of retiring today's predators altogether, but this is probably sociologically unrealistic. But what we can do is genetically tweak the lion, for example, so that either the lion eats in vitro meat or it ceases to be an obligate carnivore at all. Now, some people would protest there that a lion that isn't terrorizing, asphyxiating zebras isn't truly a lion. Whether one would say that humans who become vegans and pacifists aren't truly human, I don't know. But all I can do is essentially say, well, does this really matter? In terms of costs, today's prices, it would cost trillions, but nonetheless, price will come down. Every cubic meter of the planet will shortly become computationally accessible to micromanagement and control. Something like CRISPR-based synthetic gene drives, spread benign versions of low-pain SCN9A could be done cheaply and effectively. Essentially, once again, it is a technical problem with a technical solution. One would start off with biospheres, pilot studies, and so forth. So it's not a matter of charging in gung-ho to intervene. But tomorrow's wildlife parks could resemble the Garden of Eden, in which the lion and the wolf do lie down with lamb. The question is, do we want to conserve murder, misery, and mayhem, or whether we want a happy world in which all sentient beings can flourish physically unmolested?
I think that's very beautifully put. I do want to interject here on something that you were saying. But I think the main point here is that nature is a place where there is a great deal of suffering, and perhaps a great deal of this suffering is entirely unnecessary. And so we do have even an ethical obligation, to the extent to which it is in our power, to alleviate as much of this unnecessary suffering as we can. I think many of the doubts that people might have about this abolitionist project of ending suffering in the natural world, at least for the people that I've talked to about this, is that it's not so much that it's not a goal that they could get on board with ethically, but whether or not it's such an extraordinary feat of technology and engineering that it could actually be achieved without risking some unexpected and perhaps disastrous consequences, like the collapse of the biosphere or something. But on the other hand, if the knowledge and wisdom is truly there to do it, then I don't see a good argument against it. Going back to what you were saying before about factory farming, I've heard you say that many of the animals which humans consume in large numbers are roughly equivalent in their capacity for sentience as pre-linguistic toddlers, human pre-linguistic toddlers. And so in some sense, in some respects, the ethical stakes in how we treat them is roughly equivalent. That seems like a very strong stance to take. Would you be willing to restate that here?
Yes, I mean, there's sort of convergence of evidence that suggests that a pig, for example, is as sentient and demonstrably as sapient as a pre-linguistic toddler, and yet we treat pigs in ways that, if the victims were humans, would get the perpetrators locked up for life. And intuitively one recoils at this. One tells oneself it can't really be that bad that one's meat-eating circle acquaintance aren't akin to child abusers and serial killers. Some people will say such things as, but a pig isn't going to grow up to be an adult human. But one wouldn't say, for example, that a pre-linguistic toddler with a progressive disease that means she won't live to see her third birthday is somehow less valuable or deserves to be abused in consequence, or that it'd be a shame to let protein go to waste, pack her off to the factory farm or something. That would be utterly repugnant. In terms of actually reducing the burden of suffering in the world, I think the first thing we need to do is to stop paying for it or causing it ourselves, and that means stopping eating meat and ideally stopping animal products too.
Yeah, and along these lines, I remember Andre saying on the last podcast that in the future, if we eventually come to see ourselves more as these complex bundles of qualia, of consciousness, we may well look back at how we treated animals today as kind of a form of cannibalism, because our fundamental identity of consciousness is only going to become more obvious as things change. And so, how we're treating other species now may well become a significant part of how we define this era in history. I think it's implicit in the way that you talk about consciousness that there is this much larger state space of possible conscious experiences which exists to be discovered in a way and explored, even though for the time being most of this state space is entirely inconceivable to our minds as they exist now. So, David, why explore the infinite state space of consciousness? What kinds of things do you think might be waiting to be discovered? And how do we determine what matters?
Yeah, I think what is morally urgent is states on the pleasure-pain axis that the pleasure-pain axis, for reasons we don't understand, discloses the world's inbuilt metric of value and disvalue. And so overriding responsibility is to get rid of the bad stuff below hedonic zero. But once we have done so, then yes, all the evidence is that there is an immense range of alien state spaces of consciousness that are currently completely inaccessible to us, and that's because we have actually abolished the biology of suffering and made experience below hedonic zero physically impossible. It will be possible to explore these state spaces of experience in safety. What we will discover, at the risk of sounding lame, I simply don't know. I mean, that's the point. They are so weird. I don't think taking major psychedelics is the instant royal route to profundity and enlightenment. One of the reasons I think that these alien state spaces are so fascinating is that they haven't been recruited by natural selection for any information signaling purpose, and so that when one takes a particular agent and enters an alien state space, essentially one hasn't got the conceptual resources to explore it. Language is preeminently a social public institution. And this is in some ways a lame analogy. I'm going to give it. I sometimes use the example of, imagine a tribe of congenitally blind super rationalists, one of whose members takes a drug that induces what we would call visual experiences, incredibly intense and chaotic. Of course, he or she is right to think that this is profoundly significant. How does this drug taker convince the elders, the rationalists of the tribe, that he or she has discovered something profoundly important and significant? He or she hasn't got the sensory apparatus, transducers, to confer enhanced sensitivity to stimuli. If he or she starts talking about the ineffable or the inexpressible, that sounds rather lame. The rationalists of the tribe are going to be rather unimpressed by this talk of drugs that are, profoundly significant. But I think there is evidence that there are billions, trillions, possibly more, of state spaces of consciousness as different as sights and sounds. We will be able to use CRISPR genome editing to create new state spaces of consciousness. Essentially, I think the enterprise of knowledge has scarcely begun. That's normally one thinks of oneself as deferring to the expertise of chemists and physicists as the people who really understand the nature of matter and energy. But on the contrary, I think though quantum field theory formally, and the Standard Model formally describes the world, that essentially we do not understand the intrinsic nature of matter and energy, that most of the solutions to the fundamental equations are completely inaccessible to us, and we will only be able to responsibly explore psychedelia in depth once we have got rid of the biology of suffering.
So as we embark down this path of exploring this larger universe of possible mental states, which, as you describe, is really what the path of knowledge actually is, in a way, do you think that it is logical in a way that we will come to identify as consciousness? Do you think that consciousness itself is a good basis for our identity?
Yeah, I mean, this depends on a solution to the hard problem in one sense. It's clearly highly speculative whether consciousness consciousness is fundamental, though I press for, argue, develop a conjecture of non-materialist physicalism, it could be false. It may be simply the case that for reasons we simply do not understand, that consciousness is emergent. But running with the conjecture of non-materialist physicalism, yeah, consciousness is fundamental, but it only becomes interesting when it is phenomenally bound. I think one of the reasons why many people understandably are so dismissive of panpsychism or non-materialist physicalism is that they think one is claiming that a rock or a stone or a carrot is conscious. That's not the claim. That would be animism. The claim is that the world's fundamental fields are fields of insentience rather than insentience. Any explanation too has to explore the nature of phenomenal binding. And whereas most, though not all people, are aware of the hard problem of consciousness, quite frequently people ask to be reminded what the binding problem is, or in some cases don't see the binding problem as significant at all.
I think, what I'm getting at when I ask if consciousness is a good basis for our identity, it's not necessarily whether or not consciousness exists as a distinct, irreducible feature on the metaphysical landscape, but whether or not that is also not the best practical way of viewing ourselves as sort of moving through time. And, if we're making these changes to our minds, it doesn't seem to be a good idea to identify with the precise structure of our minds at any given time. But if we see ourselves as the light of consciousness, which is moving through all of these states, that to me seems to be the most pragmatic view of what we are. And so if we eventually go beyond what it means to be human, whatever that is, we could leave behind perhaps everything other than the fact that we are a mind, and not that we are a mind exactly, but that we are actually the changing space of consciousness.
Yes, all of this only matters because of the pleasure-pain axis, and that whatever exotic states of experience one can imagine or investigate, in the absence of hedonic coloration, good or bad, they don't intrinsically matter. That the engine of value is the pleasure-pain axis, and it's easy to fetishize what isn't intrinsically valuable. That evolution has induced us to fetishize all kinds of stimuli that are fitness enhancing but don't intrinsically matter, and likewise with alien state spaces of consciousness. In the absence of hedonic innovation, I don't think they would matter.
It does seem implicit in what you're saying, and perhaps this is obvious, but that there are moral truths to be discovered in a way, such as unnecessary suffering is bad. So does what you're saying imply that there is a discoverable universal ethics that perhaps intelligent societies of minds will eventually tend toward and converge on?
Yes, science encourages us to take the God's eye view. One is not special or privileged, that one here or now isn't inherently more significant than any other here and now. The view from nowhere. And yes, I mean, the opposite is the orthogonality thesis, but I think some form of convergence is plausible. That it's, for reasons we don't understand, built into the very nature of agony and despair is this normative aspect, the badness. Now, of course, my suffering is inaccessible to you, and you might say, well, yeah, there is nothing irrational or illogical about your being relaxed about my suffering. But I think this is an epistemological limitation, and that if one could actually experience the suffering of others, one would divine why it matters, why it is important, why it is bad. and that when we can advance perhaps to a civilization of mind melding, reversible thalamic bridges akin to the conjoined twins, the Hogan sisters, who can actually experience to some degree each other's minds, I think it's going to lead to both a moral revolution, ethical revolution, and a revolution of decision theoretic rationality. That one wouldn't say someone who steals from their own pension is some kind of super rational, super sociopath. It would seem to be irrational for them to do so. And likewise, I think post-human superintelligence won't have a false theory of personal identity, of enduring metaphysical egos, that instead will have this God's eye perspective, this capacity to access all other relevant first-person experiences and perspectives and act accordingly. And just as you would withdraw your hand from the fire, it is built into the nature of this agonizing experience that it's bad, and so you withdraw your hand from the fire. I would anticipate post-human superintelligence doing something similar for biological life, assuming that is that we haven't got rid of suffering on our own initiative.
Right. And as well, I think that in your own perspective, your experience, suffering is intrinsically bad, and because of that, it's very immediately important to you. And yet, to me, I'm not experiencing your pain exactly. And what connects us is this identity of consciousness, and that in some sense, what is happening to you is happening to me. And what actually separates the ethical significance of your pain from my experience is my ignorance of it. And so, if we could have this super perspective that you mentioned of all possible states of experience, we would intrinsically and logically have a compassionate concern to all conscious perspectives. Let's go back to panpsychism for a moment. David, if consciousness is fundamental in some way to reality, and you and I have both expressed some sympathy toward that view, how do you think that would interact with our views about ethics more broadly and how we see ourselves in the universe and what we're doing here? Do you think that they would be significantly affected by a fundamental view of consciousness?
Perhaps not as much as one might imagine, because even if consciousness is fundamental, unless you actually have a subjective experience, a unitary subjective experience, you have what is effectively just a sort of an aggregate of Jamesian mind dust, what Phil Goff called a micro-experiential zombie. That what makes anything ethically significant is being a subjective experience with a pleasure-pain axis. And so learning that, if it does transpire this is the case, that the nature of the physical is experiential, it's not as though it's like anything to be a carrot or a rock. So I don't think in that sense it would change necessarily our ethical perspective. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with kicking rocks.
Yeah, I suppose what I'm getting at with panpsychism and sort of how we see ourselves, I'm not sure exactly what the ethical calculus of it would be exactly, but just in terms of our story and how we see ourselves in the universe and what we're doing and what we are, the idea that consciousness is in some sense intrinsic to the nature of reality, that's a very different kind of story to the view of life as a chemical scum, as Stephen Hawking put it. And, consciousness as an entirely non-significant illusion. But if some species of panpsychism or idealism is correct, then the actual domain of value and significance itself is actually afforded by some very deep ontological truth about reality. And, if our minds are not a trivial illusion, but they're continuous with this sort of larger cosmological unfoldment, it's all the same scientific data, but it's a very resituated narrative from materialism.
Yeah, I mean, if this perspective is correct, essentially, physicists, orthodox physicists, and chemists don't understand the nature of matter and energy, which sounds rather counterintuitive. But I think this is the case. That someone who says, that we're just chemical scum or a bunch of chemicals, well, one cuts both ways. A bunch of chemicals are just consciousness.
Yeah, I do think that the universe is a very different kind of place due to its having this capacity to support conscious minds. It's an extraordinary fact that the universe can support this experience of subjective meaning. And if you really recognize the significance of that, there's a depth to reality which is just way beyond what any sort of outer materialist view can describe.
Yes, I mean, we haven't touched on radical and limitativism, but in one sense, but only one sense, limitativists are extremely clear-headed. There is simply no place for subjectivity if the ontology of basic science, physical science is correct. So they bite the bullet and say, well, yes, in some sense, consciousness must be an illusion. But one struggles to make any kind of plausible case here, even as a devil's advocate, because in the realm of appearance, the distinction between a reality and what seems to be collapses. I mean, this is it. Consciousness is appearance.
So we're approaching the end of our time today. The last topic that I want to get your views about is death. So, David, do you think that the end of suffering entails or connects to the end of death? How do you look at death? Is death something to be transcended eventually, or is it something that's somehow necessary to life?
I think we should phase out the biology of aging and death. And crudely, transhumanism can be said to embrace the three supers: super happiness, which I think is ultimately the most important, super intelligence, which we've been discussing, full spectrum super intelligence involving not just autistic AI, but also the capacity to explore billions of different state spaces of consciousness. But the third super, yes, super longevity, radical life extension, effectively eternal youth, I think we should be aiming for, with opt-out cryonics as an option for anyone who probably quite realistically thinks that they're unlikely to live long enough to see the end of aging otherwise. Now, this might seem rather surprising, particularly, as you know, I'm a skeptic about the notion of enduring metaphysical egos, but there's no denying that aging is a source of tremendous suffering, that death, bereavement, is a cause of tremendous suffering, and that, yeah, for evolutionary reasons, biological robots like us, Sines, we grow old and die. But just as silicon robots can be repaired and upgraded indefinitely, there doesn't seem to be any immutable law of nature that says that organic robots must grow old and perish. This is going to be a long-term project, which is why, as I say, I think it's vital to combine the approach of Sens, Aubrey de Grey, with something on the lines of cryonics. So it's an integrated strategy to defeat aging. Some people, and this may be, I think very largely is a case of rationalizing that they wouldn't want to live indefinitely, that it would be a recipe for boredom. But in practice, defeating the biology of boredom, it will be relatively trivial compared to defeating the biology of aging. That post-human life is likely to be animated not simply by gradients of bliss, but gradients of enthrallment and fascination.
Yeah, and this idea that we are kind of a stepping stone to something which is almost inconceivable to us now, I think is a useful analogy. And of course, if we are in fact successful in continuing to survive on this planet and potentially moving out into the larger universe, then there's no real issues about space to be concerned with or having a finite amount of resources. And so living indefinitely, it does seem possible, and there do seem to be already some species that don't actually age. Lobsters, I think, don't actually age, they just get damaged over time. I might not be entirely correct about that, but in principle it should be possible to change the relevant elements of our biology such that we no longer age. But, I think the question at that point would be, do we want to live forever or indefinitely? And I think if we do have a greater control over our minds at that stage as well, then we would see any potential boredom or desire to end consciousness as a problem to be solved at the level of the mind rather than actually bringing our lives to an end. Sorry, I've been rambling.
No, I mean that's a very good way to put it. Essentially, because the problem of happiness and the problem of meaning are often regarded as distinct, but in practice, by creating super happiness, we will create super meaning too. That descendants or elderly selves will probably find life suffused with an incredibly deep sense of meaning, significance, purpose, possibly to an extent that is physiologically impossible today. Now, of course, one could say, but is life that seems to be sublimely wonderful, significant, and meaningful really in some transcendent sense meaningful? But I'm not even sure that this question is intelligible.
I realised that there's a question that I wanted to ask you, which I've skipped over. And if we could just go back, I'll stitch it in later. But I wanted to ask you, at some point, you've mentioned that our ethical obligations for the world and ultimately for ourselves and other animals eventually extend out very broadly to the point at which we are in some sense responsible for looking after the entire Hubble volume or the entire reachable universe. Can you say a little bit about how you get to that view and sort of the underlying ethics which underpin it?
Yeah, although personally I'm a negative utilitarian or suffering-focused ethics Buddhist, if you like. One needn't be a negative utilitarian or a Buddhist to think that, we have an obligation to minimize, mitigate, prevent, abolish suffering wherever we find it. And that once we have discharged our ethical obligations on Earth, what about the rest of the universe, or more strictly, what about the rest of, starting off with the galaxy, then onto our local supercluster? It may well be that the accelerating expansion of the universe means that we can't get anywhere further than that. But we have to, before retreating into designer paradises, be absolutely sure that we have discharged all our ethical responsibilities. And if primordial suffering life exists within our Hubble volume, within our cosmological horizon, then I think we have a duty to reach out and rescue it too.
Yeah, and by extension, if it is indeed the case that life is not incredibly rare and that we're not actually the only relatively intelligent life to exist in the universe, then this logic would of course bring us into the ethical purview of these beings. And so aliens, ETs, if they're out there and they're sufficiently advanced in their thinking about consciousness and the hedonic landscape, perhaps they would be principally motivated to help us as well.
Yes, I would imagine so. This is kind of convergent evolution, that although that it may well be life does exist elsewhere in reality, and I suspect it will have a pleasure-pain axis too, and even super intelligent, advanced life, though it may be inconceivable in some sense, in another, I think it will occupy one part of the pleasure-pain axis. I mean, the wonderful, sublime part. But in that sense, I see a degree of universality and the prospect of convergence, that there will be no species with an inverted pleasure-pain axis, for example.
I think that the idea that ethics could converge in some way, and that ethics is something that essentially we can discover, I think that that is going to sound quite counterintuitive to people that have got the idea that all ethics is sort of the evolutionary logic of passing genetic material from one generation to the next. But I think if we take a step back and if we say that there are ethical truths, and maybe one ethical truth we can say is that suffering, unnecessary suffering at least, is bad, and maybe there is a converse axis in which we can say that exploring rarefied states of consciousness is good, then there is in some sense the possibility of a universal ethics to emerge out of that, which is actually, I think, quite a profound thing to realize, because it means that there is this possibility for progress, and even beyond what we can perhaps even conceive of now.
Yes, that's well put. I mean, one always sounds rather naive if one talks about moral progress. But if this perspective is correct, then yeah, essentially that by abolishing slavery, and that by getting rid of, I hope, shutting down factory farms, slaughterhouses, by phasing out racism, sexism, homophobia, all the kind of the ills of Darwinian life, that this really will be progress, and it's moral progress that is derivative from the pleasure-pain axis. It's not as though all sorts of activities are intrinsically bad. They are bad insofar as they impact pleasure and pain.
David, we are almost out of time for our conversation, which I've really enjoyed, but there's definitely still time to let people know where they can find out more about your ideas and go deeper into the things that you've been talking about. So yeah, where should people go to learn more about you and your work?
Well, if your audience are interested, hedweb.com, hedweb.com. It's the original motherlode site where back in 1995, when the web was young, I wrote and uploaded a manifesto, the Hedonistic Imperative. And though the design of HedWeb is extremely dated, state-of-the-art web design, 1997 or so, nonetheless, yeah, I've put most of my core material there. I've spent quite a bit of time on social media. I've cut and pasted all my core answers. Essentially, I've got a bunch of websites, but if you start at hedweb.com, you can read more or drop me an email.
I find hedweb.com to be a simple site. It's very easy to navigate, but it's definitely a piece of history. I'll definitely make sure that there's a link to that in the description. And again, David, thank you so much for making time for me and having this conversation. And I do hope that we can do this again sometime.
I very much hope so, Adrian. And yes, you are warmly welcome to visit sunny Brighton.
Oh, thank you. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with David Pearce. Remember, the best way to support the podcast is through Patreon, through the link in the description. Next time we'll be examining the comparisons between the universe and an organism, and exploring the various different ways our worldview might be different if we considered the universe to be, in some sense, a living process. But that's about it for today's episode. You've been listening to Waking Cosmos, exploring the nature of consciousness, reality, and life's place in the universe. I'm Adrian Nelson. Have a beautiful day.